Good morning. Good morning. I'm glad to be here even though there wasn't coffee. It was terrifying. I'm here to talk about humor. And humor is an interesting thing because it's usually seen as something that's frivolous. And I think it's something that's essential. Humor is what allows us to redeem moments that are otherwise lost to misery, to unhappiness, to sadness, to the things that destroy what make the day worthwhile. If I asked you, as I do, I give talks around the world, and some of them are for corporations, and because I get up and I talk about women's issues and I use the F word, which is feminism. That's the F word that my students at the University of Connecticut are still very wary about using, the F word, that's feminism. They come up to me at the beginning of the semester and you know how young people speak. You're a lot of young people here today. You know that young women, especially, even the ones who are going to be like running NASA and the head of the American Medical Association, all sound like they're asking questions, right? Even when they're making declarative statements, so that my students will come up at the beginning of the semester and say, Dr. Barreca, you're my advisor. And I'll say, okay, dear, tell me your name. And they'll go like, Stephanie Smith. And I'll say, honey, I don't know. You tell me, okay? We'll go, from there. And because they're tentative, because femininity is still wrapped up in the idea that you have to be a little hesitant about knowing anything about the world, which will be problematic when these women become Supreme Court judges, because you don't want somebody on the Supreme Court going, that's a law. I mean, you want actually somebody who's going to be able to make an assertion. So I get up and I talk about women's issues and feminism, and there'll be times when there'll be a banner at a big corporation that'll say, Dr. Regina Barreca, sexual harassment workshop. And some of the guys there think I'm there to help them do it better. And they're disappointed. And often they invite me in to give those talks when there's been a lawsuit. So, they're aware of the problems. But I explained to them early on that the short version of the talk is to recognize that harass is one word. You don't have to write it down. A lot of them have to, but I bet you would get that. And so I deal with these issues. So I deal with the serious business of justice and injustice and women's rights and anybody that's sort of been pushed to the margins. But I really do believe that humor is some of the best ways to get that point across. So when these young people come to my office at the beginning of the semester and they say, Professor Barreca, they say, you don't look like a feminist. I say, but this is what a feminist looks like. I mean, they think it means I have to not enjoy life. They think that feminism has to be very serious. They think it can't have a sense of humor. And then what's nice is that after a couple of months, young people, it's like whales. They start forming their own pods, right? So that after a couple of months, they'll come back in a pod, and there'll be a bunch of them, and, with some women and a couple of guys, and they'll come in and they'll say, okay, Professor Barreca, we've been doing, the reading, and we've been going to lectures, and we understand that it's not about sex and gender, which are, of course, two different things, but that's an entirely different whole set of circumstances. And their voices have leveled off, so I've earned my state salary, right? But then they say, so that we understand it's not actually about sex or gender, it's about any kind of marginalization, and that can come from race, that can come from any kind of choice, that could come from religion, that could come from ethnicity. It's from whatever kind of history and sort of, privilege that's actually pushed certain kinds of people to the margins of society. And if those kind of people feel like they have to ask for the privilege of their voice to be heard every generation, and they need to have that privilege sort of reestablished every time, then you lose any kind of traction that's been established before that. And if we're going to make the lives of our daughters and our sons better than the lives of our mothers and our fathers, and if we're going to carry out that sort of way to make sure that we understand that if diversity is strength, and we believe that diversity is strength, then we need to make sure that those sort of things are woven as rights into our culture and not seen as privileges, and we want to make sure that that happens. But if we do that, will we ever date? And I think it's an excellent question. I take it very seriously, and if they're mature and I know them well and I'm comfortable with them and I see them as not fragile, I tell them that they'll simply skip their bad first marriage. And tell them they can do something else with those 7 years, learn a language or take up a sport. But I really do believe that humor is the way to approach a lot of the scariest issues. And one of the ways that I learned this was by being one of the first women students at Dartmouth College, which was one of the last Ivy League schools to go co-ed. And maybe like some of you here, I was the first girl in my family ever to go to college. I was actually the first girl in my family ever to graduate from high school in a timely fashion. It wasn't what girls were expected to do. And I was raised in Brooklyn, New York by a bunch of, my mother died when I was a kid. I was sort of raised by my aunts, and I still say aunts, not aunts, because I'm from Brooklyn, and even though I've taught at the University of Connecticut for 30 years, no one has ever said, Professor Barreca, what part of Connecticut do you come from? Because my Brooklyn accent is still very much what's in place. And when I was being raised by these little aunts, these women, they don't make them anymore. But it's that way that even my students know what a 57 Chevy is, even if they've never actually ridden in a 57 Chevy. Even if they don't know these women, they know of them, like historically. These women were all 3'2". And they all weighed about 750 pounds. And they all wore floral print dresses at all times, right? So that if a group of them were gathered together on a Sunday morning, like to make the big meal for the week, it looked like there were ottomans scattered around the room, really. The only thing missing was the button on the top of the head. That was it. It was like they were on coaster, like casters. They just moved easily from one thing to the other. And they taught me about women's humor. And they, of course, never had the word feminism. They would have repudiated it if they did. But they taught me about the way that women laugh when there aren't men in the room. And for the men in the room, you can get extra credit points for learning this. Because when women laugh around men, and these are heteronormative, gender stereotypes, but somebody's got to do it. And so, I'm the queen of generalizations. But this is what girls learn probably when we're about 13. And there's no official script, but I think it's still taught. I work with a lot of young people. I still hear it. There's a sound that girls make starting when we're about 13. And it goes something like this. It's the silver bell tinkling laughter. It goes, There's some girl listening to some guy tell a 45-minute story about wanting to get an Audi with plaid upholstery. Like that's interesting, right? But he's talking about this, and the girl sitting there is going, and she's thinking, on the way home, I need to get some new eyeliner. I think I have a coupon. I'm not sure, do I have the coupon in my bag? That is not how women sound when we're having a good time. When women and girls are really laughing, we do not go, we go, ha! It is a slightly less feminine sound, right? When women are really laughing, we go, no, it's really, we do mascara wiping behavior, and even if you're wise enough not to wear mascara, we still do it. It's like this. It's an atavistic behavior, right? Anthropologists see it as being passed down through DNA. It's like, Second one, over a certain age, over a certain weight, under a certain height, bust holding behavior. We're going, because we're looking for that extra support. There's nothing wrong with that. And if you haven't experienced this yourself, certainly you've heard it from your moms and your aunts and from the older women. When women are really laughing together, we go, don't make me pee in my pants. Don't make me pee in my pants. This is why men are worried when they hear women laughing. They're afraid we'll leak. That guy who's planning to upholster his car is having serious conversations with this woman. He's terrified. So women have this fake laughter. And so, I learned this from my aunts, but we never really discussed it, right? It wasn't something that we talked about. And then I applied to go to college because I had great teachers, right? I had great teachers, and they were the ones who encouraged me to go to school. And so I go to tell my aunts, and there was always hot food. There was one aunt who was always stirring a pot of red sauce. We were Sicilian, a pot of red sauce that had been on the stove in Brooklyn since 1948. And it, you had to have hot food because somebody, might need it. Somebody could have gotten paroled. And some of you think I'm kidding. And so I went down and I told my Aunt Josephine, I said, Aunt Josephine, I'm going to go to college. And she said she stopped stirring, which meant she hadn't done that since 1948, right? And so like the earth tilted on its axis because the stirring had stopped. And she said, what do you mean you're going to go to school? I said, I'm going to go to college. She said, where are you going to go to college? I said, I'm going to go to college in New Hampshire, a place called Dartmouth. They just let girls in, they need girls. And she said, you're going to go to school in New Hampshire? I thought she was worried about the money. I said, I got a scholarship, I got work study, I got loans. She looked at me, she said, you're pregnant, right? I said, no, I'm a good student. I got into school. She said, New Hampshire. She said, it happened to your cousin Elaine. She said, you can always come home. So I go to Hanover, New Hampshire, and it's 1975. Now, they let the girls and women in as fully matriculated students 3 years before I entered. And a lot of them were alumni daughters. Maybe not most of them, but a lot of them. So they grew up in the culture. And it was very sort of high wasp. And all of the girls that I started with looked like Gwyneth Paltrow. And on a good day in 1975, I looked like Janis Joplin. So I'm walking around campus thinking, well, I got 9 months before anybody expects me home. I might as well have a good time. And I'm walking around, and I learned, because boys would come up to me, young men who had grown up in the culture of the school, who was, fathers had been there for generations, and they said, why do you want to come to a boys' school? Why are you trying to ruin everything? And for 3 years, I tried to explain why coeducation was important, maybe not in every school. I think there should be single-sex schools, but in these old, august institutions that would feed directly into law schools, into medical schools, into businesses, that there should be equal access. Even if the outcomes aren't the same, there at least have to be equal access. And they didn't listen. And by my third year, I learned that if I answered, when they said, why do you want to come to a boys' school? When our grandfathers went here, there were no women. If I learned to say by the end of it, when your grandfathers went here, there were no indoor lights. That they listened, they heard that. Because when you use humor, it's like throwing a Frisbee, and like the Labrador reaches out and catches it, whether it wants to or not. Humor is something people hear. You can get people to hear humor. So I had a friend who was a swimmer. She was practically an Olympic swimmer, and she had that swimmer's physique. She had broad shoulders, narrow waist, short hair. She was great. And we'd go to parties, and guys would come up and go, anybody take you for a man? Anybody think you were a man? And she would turn around and go, no, you? And it was just like, you want to play? We're going to play. It's like, how are we going to make this work? And so you learn to take a shortcut through humor, right? To have people hear what the implications are of what they're talking about. But when I'm talking about humor as redemption, which has come to, I've written a bunch of books about humor. The first was called, they used to call me Snow White, but I drifted. And then there's ones called It's Not That I'm Bitter, because why would I be? And there have been a number of them, Perfect Husbands and Other Fairy Tales. That got me onto Oprah, which was also an interesting thing. I was on Oprah 4 times. And at one point I was on with 2 women who had written a book about how you have to trap a man into marriage, which I didn't think was a good idea. And I'm there as the expert. And this woman got on and she said, well, Dr. Barreca, she was also from Brooklyn, we had the same accent. Well, Dr. Barreca, she said, how many times have you been married? And I said, actually, I've been married twice. And she said, well, I'm on my first marriage. And I thought, okay, I could go a couple of ways with this answer. But really, it's so close to menopause, let me be honest, So she says, I'm on my first marriage. And I said, yeah, honey, but I'm on my last. And the women in the audience all went like, ooh. And I thought, thought, oh, I'm just going to have a good time. I mean, there's really no reason not to have a good time. But the real purpose of humor, why humor is essential in everyday life, is not just to come up with a quick answer, although I think that's healthy. But it's to be able to understand that humor allows you to tell the story. Humor allows you to take an incident, something that happened to you, especially something bad or disturbing or troubling that happened to you, and to turn it into something else. It lets you get your deposit back on a moment that would otherwise be lost to misery, to grief, to frustration. So that, for example, if I ask people when I do these conferences where they have because finally at the end I'm there as like the woman whisperer and people are talking about humor, they're asking questions. And they say, but how do I develop my sense of humor? And I said, okay, if I ask you to tell me the funniest story about your childhood, tell me the funniest story about high school. Nobody tells a story about something good that happened, right? If I asked you all to tell the funniest story about your childhood, it wouldn't be the day you won the spelling bee, unless like you tied up and hid the person who was supposed to run the spelling bee under the bleachers. I mean, in a version of Carrie or something. I mean, really, we make our funny stories, the stories what the English would say that we dine off of. We make those stories automatically, instinctively, out of pain, right? But we need to keep doing that, because when something bad happens to you, you don't undermine your power by turning it into something funny. You give yourself power. You become the author of the story. It's not something that was done to you. It's something that you control. You control the narrative. When you can make a story out of it, it becomes yours. You're no longer the victim of circumstances. You are the author, the authority of the thing that happened to you. So that when something bad happens to you, you frame it as something else, not to diminish it, not to diminish yourself, but to reconsider it, okay? It's like putting something in a pawn shop, right? You walk around like with a ticket, and humor allows you to redeem it. It allows you to get it back. Humor is essential. If you write down what happens to you and then you look at it from a different angle, you have an entirely different sense of perspective, an entirely different sense of control. I suggest that when somebody comes up to you and says, if you're laughing with friends and you're up to like that, and somebody comes up and says, what's so funny? What do most of us say? Nothing. And we're thinking, you know what? It would take 3,000 years of cultural history to explain why this is funny, and I'm on a short break. But instead, be a leader. Be the author of your own life. And when somebody comes up and says, what's so funny? Tell them what's so funny. And recognize that even if that person doesn't laugh, what you haven't made is a mistake. What you've made is a terrific beginning. Thank you. Thank you.